Wait a minute. Let's see now. I've got to speak one or two words, and just to try my voice, I understand. There are two things that people always want to ask me. Well, one of them is how I ever came to write the Sherlock Holmes stories, and the other is about how I came to have psychic experiences and to take so much interest in that question. Well, first of all, about the Sherlock Holmes stories, they came about in this way. I was quite a young doctor at the time. I'd had, of course, a scientific training, and I used occasionally to read detective stories. It always annoyed me how in the old-fashioned detective story, the detective always seemed to get at his results either by some sort of lucky chance or a fluke, or else it was quite unexplained how he got there. He got there, but he never gave an explanation how. Well, that didn't seem to me quite playing the game. It seemed to me that he's bound to give his reasons why he came to his conclusions. Well, once I began to think about this, I began to think of turning scientific methods, as it were, onto the work of detection. And I used, as a student, to have an old professor. His name was Doyle, who was extraordinarily quick at deductive work. He would look at the patient. He would hardly allow the patient to open his mouth, but he would make his diagnosis of the disease and also very often of the patient's nationality and occupation and other points entirely by his power of observation. So naturally I thought to myself, well, if a scientific man like Bell was to come into the detective business, he wouldn't do these things by chance. He'd get the thing by building it up scientifically. So, having once conceived that line of thought, you can well imagine that I had, as it were, a new idea of the detective, and one which it interested me to work out. I thought of 100 little dodges, as you may say, 100 little touches by which he could build up his conclusions, and then I began to write stories on those lines. At first, I think they attracted very little attention, but after time, when I began the short adventures, one after the other, coming out month after month in the Strand magazine, people began to recognize that it was different to the old detective, that there was something there which was new. They began to buy the magazine, and it prospered, and so I may say did I. We both came along together, and from that time, Sherlock Holmes fairly took root. I've written a good deal more about him than I ever intended to do, but my hand has been rather forced by kind friends who continually wanted to know more. And so it is that this monstrous growth has come out of what was really a comparatively small seed. Now, the curious thing is how many people there are in the world who are perfectly convinced that he is a living human being. I get letters addressed to him, and I get letters asking for his autograph, get letters addressed to his rather stupid friend, Watson. I've even had ladies writing to say that they'd be very glad to act as his housekeeper. One of them, when she heard that he had turned to the occupation of keeping bees, wrote saying that she was an expert at segregating the queen, whatever that may mean, and that she was evidently predestined to be the housekeeper of Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if there's anything more I could say with advantage about him. But on the other point, which is to me, of course, a very much more serious one, on the question of my taking up this psychic matter, people ask me, will I write any more Sherlock Holmes stories? I certainly don't think it's at all probable. But as I grow older, the psychic subject always grows in intensity, and one becomes more earnest upon it. And I should think that my few remaining years will probably be devoted much more in that direction than in the direction of literature. Oh, goodbye. Come along.
I am joined by author and journalist James Lovegrove. He has written a series of Sherlock Holmes novels for Titan Books, including The Stuff of Nightmares, Gods of War, and The Thinking Engine. Thanks for joining me today, James. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes back in 1887, and it seems like the interest in this detective never seems to diminish. Why is it that people are so obsessed with him?
Well, I think the thing is that everybody wants to see justice being done. Everyone wants to see criminals brought to account for their crimes, especially these days, because we seem to live in a world where there's a lot of chaos and where the bad guys appear to be winning. So there's that. And I think also what people forget about Sherlock Holmes is that he has Dr. Watson with him at all times, and they together are a perfect combination. Sherlock Holmes is the head, if you see what I mean. It's for him, it's all about thinking. He is a brain, whereas Watson provides heart. Watson is impulsive and kind and heroic. And I think together that perfect combination is one of the reasons why they've lasted.
Well, Sherlock Holmes is one of the most widely adapted works of fiction in all of history. How is it possible to keep on inventing mysteries for him to solve?
Well, I think what Conan Doyle did was he created this huge broad canvas, but he only painted in a very small corner of it. So that's left a lot of space for others like me to come along and fill in the gaps. Because Holmes had a career of, I think, about 30 years, but Conan Doyle only records, 56 short stories and 4 novels, so 60 cases in all. We, therefore, can come in and create new ones for ourselves because there's so much room to do it. In my case, what I do is I try to bring in an element that wouldn't normally be seen in a Sherlock Holmes story. For instance, in one of them, I have him coming up against a kind of Victorian-era superhero. And in another one, I have him encountering a very primitive computer that appears to have artificial intelligence. So there's plenty of room to bring in these different elements, but as long as you stick to the rules that Conan Doyle set, the deduction, the London setting, the relationship between Holmes and Watson, you can do anything you like, but as long as you keep the core elements straight, it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, how would you like to see Sherlock Holmes evolve as a person and a detective in the future?
The funny thing is, I don't think I really do want him to evolve much. Although I like some of the modern interpretations of Sherlock Holmes, such as the BBC show Sherlock and the American one Elementary, I prefer to think of Sherlock Holmes as being frozen in time, as this archetype of a Victorian middle-class gentleman. I like to think that you could go to Baker Street and you would hear a violin scraping away in the rooms upstairs, and you would be looking through the fog towards this light in the window, and you would know that you could go into that house and Sherlock Holmes would be there, and you could come to him with your problem and it would be solved.
The villains, victims, Drebber and Stangerson, were characterized as miserable, disgusting characters who probably deserve their fate, considering that they killed the farriers, who we are made very much to like. And Jefferson Hope is the hero of the story, despite being the murderer. And to his credit, unlike other revenge-driven killers, there is absolutely no collateral damage in this. He kills his targets and no one else. Though I guess the innkeeper's son is wrongfully detained, and then there's that sick dog that Sherlock puts down with Hope's poison pills. But other than that, the story is told very well and had a great pacing. A lot of older stuff can be slow burn, but this was edge-of-the-seat excitement. This was a welcome surprise in terms of pacing. This also doesn't feature any old-timey racism, unlike a lot of other writing of the time, and even writing that's more modern than this. Good on Doyle for that. It completely takes me out of a story to have to read the old-timey racism, but there was none of that here. I also like the way that the format of the story was given, being from Watson's perspective, effective apart from Hope's backstory, because it makes the bit about Hope's backstory even more striking. When I was reading it, I swear I started a completely different story until I saw the name Jefferson Hope and realized it was a part of the main one. In doing so, it made me pay attention more to the story because I was looking for familiar names that would tie back into the Holmes and Watson plot. I don't know if that's a trend with Doyle's early work, but I really hope it is, because it is really damn cool. The story is a classic, and I would be a pretty bad book reviewer if I didn't recommend this book. Is the portrayal of Mormons flawed? Probably, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the story perfectly encapsulates the personalities of the protagonists and is formatted in a very intuitive way that makes the story enjoyable. I'd take its portrayal of Mormons with a grain of salt, but other than that, the story is utterly phenomenal. It's engaging, has a pacing that won't turn off modern readers, and one of the things that makes Sherlock Holmes so enduring is, despite taking place in the past, it's an utterly timeless story. Overall, A Study in Scarlet was a brilliant start to the long canon of Sherlock Holmes, and you don't need to be a detective to figure that out. That joke was terrible. Who writes this crap?
Now, I did say that this novel was in two halves. The first part is, Holmes and Watson, they try to decipher how the man died and whatnot. And then the second part happens. Now, how do I describe the second part? It's basically a Wild West Mormon love affair. Okay, let that sink in. Seriously. Halfway through the novel, it goes to America, in which we find two travelers in the Wild West who are saved by Mormons. What? And of course you think, what, is the story finished? Is that it? Did it just end? Is this another story? The 50-page Mormon love affair that happens in the Wild West does, strangely, have to do with the case. Arthur Conan Doyle. I know it's the first Sherlock Holmes novel, but what the hell was that? It just it took the pace of the novel and just broke it over its knee. It almost ruined it. I was just sitting there, just reading this. It was like a fucking John Wayne movie. It was like, what has happened to this novel? And then, of course, at the end, it goes back to London, but it's like, what is that? I actually just decided to look through some of the reviews on Goodreads, and most of the people are like, why is there an episode of Big Love happening in the middle of this novel? But of course, the Wild West Mormon love affair escapade does, eventually, make sense in the end. And, it's good enough. It's not, but, it's still, I can see why it's there, and I appreciate why it's there, but I just don't think it should be there. So, in the end, I decided to give this A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle 4 out of 5 stars. It, of course, lost that 1 star because of the Mormon Wild West love affair, and I never knew I'd mentioned those words in that succession in a video before, and not so many times either. Mormon Wild West love affair. Hopefully that'll be the last time I'll ever have used those words.